Case law, Carlill vs. Carbolic Smoke Ball Co. Welcome. Today, we'll explore a landmark contract law case, Carlill vs. Carbolic Smoke Ball Company, 1893, which helped define the enforceability of unilateral contracts. Let's begin with the central legal issue. Was the company legally obligated to pay Mrs. Carlill, or was their advertisement just a sales gimmick? To understand the court's decision, let's examine. Scene opens in a cozy Victorian-era home. Mrs. Carlill sits on a couch, reading a newspaper. The Carbolic Smoke Ball Company advertised a flu remedy called the Carbolic Smoke Ball. Their newspaper ad made a bold promise. The screen zooms in on the newspaper ad, which reads smiley face. Use the Carbolic Smoke Ball as directed, and if you still get the flu, we'll pay you £100. To prove we're serious, we've deposited £1,000 in the bank. Mrs. Carlill raises an eyebrow, intrigued. Mrs. Carlill, £100. That's a lot of money. If they're serious, I might as well try it. Narrator. Trusting the ad, Mrs. Carlill purchased the smoke ball, used it as instructed, and waited. Cut to Mrs. Carlill using the smoke ball, inhaling the vapors. A moment later, she sneezes loudly. Mrs. Carlill, frustrated. What? I still got the flu. Time to claim my £100. She picks up a pen and writes a letter to the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company. But the company refused to pay, arguing that their advertisement was just a promotional statement, not a legally binding contract. Issue: was the company legally obligated to pay Mrs. Carlill? Rule: scene shifts to a courtroom. A judge sits at the bench, reviewing the case. To decide this case, the court examined the principles of contract law. For a contract to be valid, it must have. Text appears on screen as the narrator lists the elements smiley face. Offer: the company's ad made a clear promise. Acceptance: Mrs. Carlill followed the instructions and used the product. Consideration: she spent money and effort relying on the promise. Cut to Mr. Carbolic, the company's representative, standing confidently in court. Mr. Carbolic: but it was just an advertisement. No one takes these things literally. The judge shakes his head. Judge, not so fast. This was a unilateral contract, a promise made to the public, which became legally binding once the conditions were fulfilled. Rule: unilateral contracts are enforceable when the terms are met. Application. Scene returns to the courtroom. Mrs. Carlill stands confidently, while Mr. Carbolic looks nervous. Now, let's apply this rule. Mrs. Carlill followed the instructions exactly. The company even deposited money in the bank to show sincerity. That means their promise wasn't just advertising, it was legally binding. The judge nods in agreement and bangs the gavel. Judge, the court rules in favor of Mrs. Carlill. The company must pay her £100. Mr. Carbolic gasps, looking shocked. Application: the company was legally bound to its promise. Cut to Mrs. Carlill holding a check for £100, smiling proudly. And sir, Mrs. Carlill won her case, setting an important precedent in contract law. Advertisements can create legally binding contracts if they contain a clear promise and an acceptance method. Carlill, winking at the camera. Contracts matter, folks. The judge nods approvingly, while Mr. Carbolic sulks in the background. Conclusion: the court ruled in favor of Mrs. Carlill, reinforcing the enforceability of unilateral contracts.